Welcome to the Luminous program. I'm very happy to be with you today. My name is Father Eric Ma. I'm the pastor of St. Joseph the Worker Parish in Oshawa, Canada. I'm also the priest chaplain of three schools, actually, UOIT, Durham College, and Trent. And so what I'd like to do today is share with you a gospel from John, which is really close to my heart, and it's basically a passage involving the Last Supper. So I'll read that for you right now. After saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, "Very truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So while reclining next to Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in a dish." So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After he received the piece of bread, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, "Do quickly what you are going to do." Now, no one at the table knew why he had said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the common purse, Jesus was telling him, "Buy what we need for the festival," or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the piece of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. So what I'd like to do, I'll round back to the gospel eventually, but first of all, I'd like to begin by talking about a movie, actually. And this movie came out on the Friday before Holy Week, so the Friday before Palm Sunday. And it's called Paul the Apostle of Christ. Paul the Apostle of Christ. And so I saw it on the Monday of Holy Week, because that's my day off. That's a typical day off for most priests. And I gotta admit, I thought it was okay. I wanted to like it. I wanted to love it. I didn't really like it. I thought it was kind of mediocre. I thought it was merely okay. That said, I thought a couple scenes were pretty good, and I just want to focus on one right now because it's pertinent to what we want to talk about with regards to the gospel. So basically, I mean, you probably guessed that the movie is about St. Paul, apostle to the Gentiles. And the movie basically revolves around a series of interviews between St. Paul and his friend St. Luke. So basically, you probably know this, St. Paul, he was put in prison as a result of accusations by the Emperor Nero. He was accused of trying to burn down the city of Rome. And obviously, it wasn't true, but that's how things played out. So Paul was in prison awaiting his execution, basically, by way of beheading. And so before that was to take place, Luke was visiting him recurringly in prison to get some last details about his life, particularly his conversion experience, and also to kind of glean some last remnants of wisdom that he might share with the early Christian community. In any case, the scene I have in mind from the movie, again, St. Luke is talking to St. Paul, and at a certain point, St. Paul asks St. Luke, how's it going? Not just how's it going with you, but how's it going with the early Christian community? So, as you probably know, I mean, back in the day, the early Christian community, the early church in Rome, they were suffering really badly. They were being persecuted heavily. They were being killed. Some of them were even being lit up like human candles in the streets. And so things were pretty bad. And so St. Paul is asking, how are they doing? How are you doing? And whatnot. And so what happened is St. Luke began to recall this kind of earlier episode where he was talking to the early Christian community who were basically struggling with this idea of how to respond to these kind of massive persecutions. And in particular, St. Luke referenced the fact that many of the young men in these communities were wanting to respond with a sort of answering violence. And so Luke was trying to counsel them by saying, look, you can't fight the world with the weapons of the world. So Bishop Robert Barron talks about the weapons of the world in terms of, again, sort of an answering violence. And St. Luke is counseling these young men, look, you can't do this for a couple of reasons. First of all, when you respond to violence with an answering violence, it tends to escalate things. So just from purely temporal perspective, that's not good. But also on a deeper level, and again, Bishop Barron talks about this as well, it undermines your message. So the whole idea is that the advocates of the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ himself, they can't fight the world using the weapons of the world because, again, it undermines their message. If your underlying message is peace and reconciliation and the good news of the gospel, and you respond to violence with an answering violence, then, again, it looks bad. And so St. Luke counseled the young men, and they kind of backed down and whatnot. So Luke was telling Paul this story. And so, Paul's hearing this, and he's saying, okay, so the men were expressing these concerns, and what did you say? And Luke says kind of half-heartedly, I told them the only way is love. And Paul, because he's wise and perceptive, and because Luke is his friend, he says to Luke, like, okay, so you said the answer was love, but you don't really believe it, you know. And at that point, like Luke kind of loses it, and he gives free rein to his inner frustration. And he says, this world basically doesn't know a thing about love. And he goes on to enumerate all these different ways in which the world doesn't seem to know about love. It talks about abortion, infanticide, again, religious intolerance, persecution, massive violence up and down the board, which, funny enough, seems to kind of mirror our own situation here. It's very reminiscent for me anyways of this expression by Mark Twain. He says, history doesn't repeat itself, but boy, does it rhyme, And so there's a certain parallel between the persecution of the early Christians at the time in the city of Rome and certainly in our situation here. So this scene is relevant not just for dramatic purposes, but for us. How do we deal with religious persecution in the state of society right now? Anyways, when it comes to any sort of visual dramatic production, when we're talking about like a play or a movie, blocking is always really important, like how the scene is framed and where characters are in relation to each other. And so up to this point, like Luke is technically higher than St. Paul. So St. Paul, partially because he's been beaten and tortured, like he's sort of in a reclining position, like resting as he's talking to St. Luke up to this point in the scene. And it's not that St. Luke is towering over him, but he's like a little bit higher. He's like crouching, but he's like technically higher than St. Paul. But at this point in the scene, Paul switches things. And so he stands up and he becomes kind of higher than St. Luke, and Luke kind of backs down. And then St. Paul assumes the position of a teacher and a mentor. So he stands up and he towers over St. Luke because he wants to teach him something very important, not just for him, but for the Christian community. And so he goes on to articulate all these different characteristics which are kind of definitive of true, authentic love, godlike love. And so he says, love is patient, love is kind. Love is not boastful or irritable or arrogant. Love does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. Love endures all things, suffers all things, and bears all things. And love never ends. And we hear that, and gosh, it sounds familiar because it becomes the bedrock and the foundation of that very famous gospel in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, which is read at weddings all the time. But I mean, to hear it being recited, all those characteristics of love in the context of the scene, in the context of violence and persecution, it takes on a whole new meaning. People, they read this gospel or this passage from Paul at weddings, and it seems to be kind of all cute and nice, but to see it in the scene being played out, you realize there's a great strength there. And so what St. Paul is saying to St. Luke, if you read between the lines, your primary difficulty when it comes to, like counseling these young men, counseling the Christian community, is you think at the end of the day that love is weak. You think that love is weak. But love is not weak, love is strong. It takes great strength to be patient and to be kind in the face of persecution. It takes great strength to suffer and endure and to wait for God to come through for you, when it comes to times of trial, when people are being not just mean, but they're trying actively to persecute you and to kill you. And so you got to believe, you got to be convicted of the fact that love is not weak, love is actually strong. When I think about this, obviously, there's a bunch of different examples we can use to kind of further illustrate this point, but there's a reason why I picked today's gospel, because I think it's a really great gospel to really emphasize this idea here. And obviously, the gospel, it kind of highlights this image of the Last Supper. And I think for us, when we hear about the Last Supper, certain images come to mind, obviously. You think about the washing of the feet. You think about the institution of the Holy Eucharist. You think about the institution of the priesthood, as you should, But at the same time, I think our minds and our imaginations we drift to these conventional images and we think, well, therefore, I mean, the Last Supper was all about, peace and reconciliation and fellowship. And it's not entirely wrong, but I think, as with many passages in the gospel, you got to read between the lines. Because if you read between the lines, you realize that in the heart of Christ, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of heartache. And why? Because he knows that, to a man, each one of these guys, again, without exception, they're all going to betray him. And so one has already betrayed him, Judas Iscariot, betrayed him for 30 pieces of silver. Another one, his most trusted ally, St. Peter, he's going to deny him 3 times, the last time to a mere servant girl. And again, all of them, with the exception, I guess, of St. John, they're all going to leave him at the moment of his greatest need, and when he's like dying and just hanging there on the cross. People are just going to take off, and he's going to be with John, his mother, and just a few other women. And so that's the situation. And it's made all the worse because, in the context of the Last Supper, everyone's like, oh, I'm going to be your friend. I'll be with you to the end. And don't worry, even if other people betray you, I'll stick with you. They're all saying this. And so like hypocrisy is in the air, You realize that he doesn't chew them out, He's not harsh. He's not vindictive. He doesn't call them out for their hypocrisy. Instead, he's super generous and super patient, exquisitely so. Lavishes upon them gift upon gift and grace upon grace, Again, washing the feet, giving them the gift of the Holy Priesthood, giving them the gift of the Holy Eucharist, his own body and blood. And the question is, like, why? And, again, you got to read between the lines, but I think the reason why is because he believes, he truly believes that with time and with patience, and certainly by God's grace, these people can become great. These people can become great witnesses and leaders of the church. These people can change the world. They're not there yet, but they could be, And so he's kind of reading between the lines and says, okay, what do they need right now from me? They don't need me to be harsh. They don't need me to call them out. They need me to be patient, to give them time, to become the persons that God is calling them to be. That's what they need. And because he believes all that, the Lord is willing to suffer and endure all things right now. And you got to realize, Christ, his divine wisdom in all this, because on a deeper level, he's trying to educate these men in the ways of love. I mean, up to this point, he's talking about love and forgiveness and whatnot. But this is where the rubber hits the road, because he knows that most of them, I mean, obviously not all of them, Judas Iscariot doesn't come back, but most of them will come back. And they'll recall this moment, and they'll look back and they'll think, gosh, we were so bad to him. We were so bad to him. We were hypocrites. We were unfaithful. We pretended we were something we were not. And he was so kind to us, so generous, gave us all those gifts. He could have chewed us out, but he didn't, And they'll remember that, And then they'll really own this idea of, look, love others as I have loved you. Forgive others as I have forgiven you. And this whole idea of loving others and forgiving others in the model of the Master, they'll want to do it. It won't be this thing kind of imposed from the outside. This is something you should do because the church says so, or because God requires it of you. They'll want to do it as this thing from their hearts. Like, here's this man, here's this, the Son of God who was kind to us and patient to us when he didn't have to be, but he was. And so now I'm inspired and I'm moved in my heart to love others as he has loved us, to forgive others as he's forgiven us. Now, hopefully you can see the practical implications of this. We all have people in our lives, not unlike the disciples at the Last Supper. We often think of our enemies in terms of the classical sense. Here's my enemy who's like actively against me and whatnot. But you got to realize that confessionals are filled with people who have hurt us, who are close to us. The people who are close to us because of proximity, because we spend our lives with them. They're the ones who typically hurt us, and we hurt them in turn. It's just the way communities go. So you think about families and friends and coworkers, children. They always say parishioners, but there's this whole thing where just because we're living in proximity and we go through all different shades of life, we can rub each other the wrong way, and there's good moments when we can be inclined to go the way of impatience when it comes to these people I just kind of mentioned. But when you're inclined to kind of give in to that temptation, take a step back, and think of today's gospel. Think of St. Paul. Think of the first letters to Corinthians. And realize that even though it might not feel like it at the time, God calls even these people to be great. He calls them to be holy. He calls them to be set apart, And in a certain sense, he needs our help, And how do we help the Lord? By loving these people to the end, in the way that St. Paul talks about. To be patient, to be kind, to suffer, and to endure. In other words, to help these people become the persons that God is calling them to be, the Lord asks us, be strong. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Really with pleasure, through the intercession of our Mother, the Blessed Virgin Mary, May God bless us and keep us constantly under His blessing. He who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. God bless you.
Shalom World, God's own channel.